So this is the last in our series on everyday courage, saying I love you. This week when we're sending love cards to our friends and our family, maybe. Definitely our children are passing around Valentines. We've been through a series on saying yes and saying no and saying sorry and letting go and being authentic, and now saying I love you. We conclude with maybe the most important and difficult thing to say. Important because it's the glue of our relationships to pronounce love. And difficult because it requires vulnerability. It risks damage or loss of relationships. If timed poorly or to the wrong person at the wrong time, it can end things. It risks having our perspective challenged, but it can also heal, and it can break us open. There are many times in your life when I'm guessing you winced when someone said, I love you, unsure that it was true, unsure of yourself. Maybe it was too soon, or you thought it might be a means to an end. Or maybe it was what you longed to hear. Maybe it was said across the sea, like in Neruda's poem, in a prayer sent on the wind heading your way, or in a letter, a keepsake, a memory. They are three precious words all the same. One that center in your own personal experience, I. Two, that states the most powerful thing in the world, love. And three, points it at another, you. It can be frivolous, it can be meaningful, it can be hopeful, it can be dangerous, it can be a sign of forgiveness, it can be a joyous statement. All the same, I am sure that if we are to survive as human beings, we are going to need these three words more than any others. Now, Kelly Corrigan, in her book, Tell Me More, that Beth read a piece of, in it she says statements like, I love you. It's not about what you're wearing or what you are today. It's an unconditional statement of forgiveness. Now, sometimes it follows a run of complaints, and this is her point. I call it her even though run, or even though statement list. In the reading, she says, and I think she's speaking to her husband, or maybe vice versa, I love you even though I heard you yell sharply at our kids again, and you still can't seem to bring yourself to be nicer to my mother and ask for that raise, even though I love you. Even though moments probably count too many in our own lives, they are real, they are everyday experiences, and if we're honest, they also can bring us together when they're followed by those three words. There are people in my life that I have used the even though moment with, mostly to the good. Here's my version of her even though statement. Parent to teenager, I love you even though after you threw out the dinner I cooked, left your tissues in a line like breadcrumbs of Hansel and Gretel to your room. And then after asked, how were you doing and how was your school day, you stared at your phone and didn't reply, and then cursed the school, and then slammed the door, and then demanded I come back and give you a neck rub, even though I love you. Middle-aged child to elder parent, even though when I ask you how you are, you give me your medical report. Talk over each other when we call on the phone, drive us crazy with your worry and your play-by-play over the TV show we're watching, even though I love you. I'm sure you have your own versions. The common theme, though, is that it takes courage to say, I love you, to get to the end of that paragraph, to apply the glue that holds us together. It requires some vulnerability. It requires the risk that we damage or lose relationships, that we are wrong or wrong ourselves, but it also heals. It also heals because it breaks us open. And I firmly believe that we can be broken open when we say love, because we are strong enough to have our hearts broken open. We are inheritors of love that resides in our very beings. We are inheritors of traditions that push us toward love and ask us to transcend boundaries and prejudice and the challenges that keep us apart. I believe this is true, that we are strong enough to be broken open with God as a love, even when the world seems broken and hateful, even when it seems incapable of transcending the boundaries that keep us apart. Love pierces us deeply. And that can be a love that we share between people. It can be a love that we cultivate in a great movement. And I read a story recently that I think did both. It was a story by Tony Campolo, an evangelical minister. He calls himself a red line evangelical because he tries to stick close to the foundations of Christianity rather than all the stuff that's been added to it over thousands of years. He tells a story where he was a speaker at an evangelical crusade in Sacramento, California, held in a huge arena, maybe 40 times the size of this room. Thousands of people attended. The music was good, the preaching was good, ecstatic, but the next day the planning committee came together and complained that there was no media coverage of the event. Tony, who I like as a guide for ministry, waited for everyone to talk about their complaints. And then he said, you know, Mick Jagger was here last week and he got no coverage either. And then he made the suggestion. He said, you know, this is World AIDS Week. Let's do something about that. If you want news coverage, put out a press release that the offering tonight will go to programs in Sacramento to minister to people suffering from AIDS. If you want news coverage, he said, you have to make the news. He said it's news when a bunch of evangelicals are willing to express love in a tangible way for people with AIDS. He said, we say that we love all people, but it's usually a lot of words. Let us put our money where our mouths are, he said, and see what happens. So miraculously, they agreed. They knew that their reputations as evangelical Christian preachers who condemned gay men who had AIDS as God's punishment was in the middle of all this, but they said they were willing to try. That night, the media came. They swarmed the place. The choir sang, Tony preached, the TV cameras paid no attention to what was going on until the collection basket. Buckets and baskets were passed, and the cameras came on, and people started taking pictures of evangelicals giving to people with AIDS, most of whom at that time were gay. And later that night in his hotel room, Tony watched the news. On one station, an old woman who was moved to tears said to the news camera, she said, my grandson has AIDS. And this is the first time that I've been able to talk about it, because up until now, I was made to feel so ashamed of him. I feel he was affirmed tonight. A big, I love you. In the same interview, the camera turned to a big tough-looking guy with his hair a mess in need of a shave. They asked him, well, what do you think of the offering tonight? The guy answered in a gruff voice, what about it? The interviewer braced and said, well, people with AIDS are usually homosexual, and you evangelical Christians haven't been very kindly disposed to them, have you? And how do you feel about your money going to people who are probably gay? And the man looked at the interviewer without missing a beat. He said, I don't know anything about them. All I know is when people are sick, we're supposed to take care of them. And that because we are Christians, we must love everybody. A big, I love you. Tony cheered so loud that night, his neighbors in the hotel thought he was watching a football game. And years later, when Tony and his son, who came out as gay, stood in front of evangelicals and said, I love him, we love you. And Tony was pushed to the side of many circles. There were those who were in Sacramento who stood by them. A big I love you was what they stood for. That kind of love that transcends boundaries, some call the love of God. Something that's so large that it transcends our own making even, but that we participate in all the same. Now, if you read parts of the Bible, you could make the case that God is a God of punishment and wrath and damnation and floods and lots of smoting and power plays and anger and all sorts of things like that. But you can also see a God of love, of creation. God that takes terrible things and turns them into forgiveness. A God that takes incredibly painful moments and turns them into tender love. It's the kind of love that Dr. Peter Gomes, who preached at Memorial Chapel in Harvard once upon a time, the late Dr. Gomes, called a love so great we could not resist. He said, and I quote, I do not believe God moves in thunderstorms or speaks in accents or natural disasters. I do not believe that God interferes in that often tragic course of the world's activities. Rather, I believe that God has made us and thus made his work our opportunity. God has chosen not to act in the form of phenomena. He has chosen to act in the form of men and women who know him, love him, serve him. God acts in the likes and lives of us. I think Gomes would have us know that we are not objects of a wrathful or benevolent God, but rather we are the activity of God in the world. And through our love, God is known. Now, I've been thinking about this as I prepared to speak to you this week, and I've been thinking a lot about my friend and departed colleague, Forrest Church, the former minister of All Souls, New York City, who served there so many years. I knew Forrest a little bit at the end of his life. He counseled me on how to find a good associate minister like Beth and Aaron. He counseled me on writing and publishing and how to balance family life with work life. And he was here on this chancel just months before he died in 2009. Charles McMullen and I took him out for a beer after that. He didn't have one because he had cancer, but we had one. And he told us stories of ministry and book tours. The one thing I knew about him was that he ended every sermon with the words, Amen, I love you, and may God bless us all. As I was thinking about that, I reached out to the current senior minister at All Souls New York, my friend Galen Gingrich, who was Forrest's associate. And Galen sent me the sermon that he preached 2 days after Forrest died, in which Galen tells the story of when he was visiting with Forrest, toward the end of his life, he asked him to explain why at the end of every sermon he said, "Amen, I love you, may God bless us all." And Forrest said this in reply. He said, "I think people understand what I'm trying to communicate when I say I love you from the pulpit. People know I'm not saying I love you in a romantic sense." He said, "When I say I love you from the pulpit, something connects. I get connected to the congregation and they get connected to each other. It's almost like for a moment at least we are part of each other, of something larger than ourselves. It's the human form of love, divine, as the poet Blake put it." And Forrest concluded saying this, "And besides, someone once told me that I'm the only person in her life who ever says, 'I love you.' She comes to church to hear someone say that she matters." I thank Galen for the gift of that story to me. It made me think of the times when I have said I love you from this pulpit. On occasion, especially in particularly difficult times when we were seeing our world as very frail, when another violent act transgressed our lives, when human failure pierced us to the core, or when I had lost hope or suffered a setback. I have ended my sermons like Forrest did. I have done this because in some ways, even just for me, it symbolized that we shared something bigger than each of us, and that I needed to be reminded of a love bigger than any of us. In other times, I felt that its need arose because I showed you somehow in a story or in a sermon my own faults or my own failures. In some way, my soul had been on display, and I knew that I could not only say I love you, but that in saying that, I was saying I trust you. And then that if all that failed and fell away, it would only be even though. And I would have to give up this honest ministry. I have said I love you from this pulpit, also because I know that Sundays, for a moment, we are part of each other. We are connected to each other. And as Blake put it, we remember when we say, I love you, the power of love means that if a thing loves, it is infinite. And if you have heard me say it, you have heard me also add the word friends. And always followed by my benediction, which is a gentle, loving push into the world of love. I have preceded my I love you not with even though, but with the word friends, because we are not family, we are not lovers, but we build this place of friendship, looking into each other's eyes, trying to make sense of the world and its rhythms. As the moon turns its clockwork dream and the biggest stars look at me with your eyes, and as I love you, the pines in the wind want to sing your name with their leaves of wire. That is what's happening here. That is why we are friends. So friends, here we are loved. So your spiritual homework, can you guess what it's going to be? That you look at someone today who means something to you, who needs to hear those words, who needs the glue applied in the relationship, and genuinely speak the words, I love you. Because love will heal us. and it will hold us. So, friends, amen. I love you, and may God bless us all.